he was waiting for somebody else to kick it off.
Oh.
I'm going to do it. So I'm going to tell you that if you are available this Wednesday at 1:15, come join us in the room the conference room that has the chairs around it, following the noon lunch and Bible study, to come have a more small group conversation with Ryan. He will be doing the noon Bible study. He will be giving us a character study of Moses. New Song will be singing the song Moses. I know that it is a very long day for those of you that will have been to New Song practice, then sing, have lunch, listen to the character study, but we would still love for you to join us, and we will not be a very lengthy time. But look forward to that time. Enough of you have said you'll be there. We look forward to it. And any other announcements not related to prayer requests, which we'll have at the end of class time? If not, here's Ryan.
Good.
Well, good morning. Happy Spring Break Sunday for some of those who are not here, right? And happy St. Patrick's Day.
Yes.
Appreciated amount of green in the room today. So that's always fun. A word about Wednesday. We have about 35 or 40 minutes to present a character of the Bible, and sometimes that's a character who takes up just a few verses of the Bible. And some weeks you have Moses, like I will have this week. And so we're going to try to do the whole span of Moses' life in 40 minutes. But we'll do the best we can on Wednesday. But yeah, we'd love to see you there, but understand if you're not able. But this morning, as you know, Mark Wingfield is on his sabbatical. This is his third of 6 weeks, I believe. Is that right? And so he is. If you are on Facebook, if you're online, you're connected to Mark, be sure to check out some of his pictures because they are just stunning. These places he's going, these ancient ruins, these cathedrals, these libraries, all kinds of things. So very grateful for him because that leaves some room for the residents to come in and talk to you all. So you don't have to hear from Mark all the time. Just kidding. We're grateful for that. But as many of you will know, because I think most of you are here most weeks, we are in this red letter kind of words of Jesus study that is quite long if you do every single one. But we are just getting started with that a few weeks in. And so I'll be here this week and the next two as your adopted resident for this Discovery class. So I'm glad to have this chance to be with you for a couple weeks in a row, or 3 weeks in a row. I think anything you need to know from me, any life updates that I can give you before I jump in?
I'd like to introduce my friend Sherry Jacobini. She's
Sherry.
visiting with us today.
Great.
And
Well,
lives
welcome.
in the same complex that I do.
Oh, hi.
Glad to have you.
Morning.
Yes, Sherry.
Good. So that's a little bit about what we're doing right now, and I'm substituting this week, so we're talking about
She already knows
the red
about
letter. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, good.
She figured.
That's right. And just by way of information, my mom is here this week. She'll be in 11 o'clock worship, so you're welcome to come say hello to her. She has come this week while Bates is on spring break, our almost 3-year-old, 2.5-year-old. So that's been a great help to have Mimi here, which is always very helpful. But let's say a word of prayer before we dive into some of these words of Jesus in the Gospels. Oh God, we are grateful for time to study and to learn and to think and to hear these words from you. These words in Scripture that have profoundly impacted our lives and the lives of all who have gone before us for generations. Help us to be open to how they might speak to us today, and help us to live them out each day as we go from this place. It is in the loving name of your Son that we pray. Amen. So I have the task of speaking to you about the fishers of men, or fishers of people, referenced in Matthew, Mark, and Luke today. So I went ahead and helped you out by giving you a handout of those 3 verses. So you can find it in your Bible. If people are online, they can find that in their Bible. But just so you can see those kind of side by side, we're looking at a few verses from Matthew, a few verses from Mark, and then a longer section of Scripture from the Gospel of Luke. everybody have one of these handouts that I'm referring to? Okay. And then there's a couple of pictures on the back that we'll reference at some point, and I'll mention how to get to those online. But so we are in this section. I'm sorry.
Is this the boat that they discovered not long ago under all that?
It is, and I'm gonna tell that story in just a little bit, but that's exactly what that is. And so we're just gonna dive into these scriptures. I'm gonna kind of briefly go through them, not word by word, but just kind of give you a sense of where these are, and then I'm gonna help give us some contextual background, exegetically, where we are in Scripture, where Jesus is in his journey, his story in each of these Gospels, because it's a little bit different. As an overview, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the three Gospels known as the Synoptic Gospels, you will probably know. But synoptic being seeing together. And so three understandings of Jesus' life that are fairly similar to one another. And so John being the outlier, and Mark being, some scholars say, probably the first and probably the source, one of the sources for Matthew and Luke, which is part of why particularly Matthew and Mark look so similar in this instance. Luke being particularly drawing from an additional source. But these are these gospel stories that tell the story of Jesus more similarly to one another than John does. And so they tell this story, Matthew and Mark, almost identically, and then Luke tells it a little bit differently. So in Matthew and Mark, as you see, Matthew chapter 4, 18 through 22, and then Mark chapter 1, 16 through 20, we have Jesus passing by the Sea of Galilee, so we're setting our place, and he sees in both instances two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea. So these are fishermen. So we've kind of set the where and the who a little bit. And Jesus says to them, in Matthew, follow me and I will make you fish for people. In Mark, follow me and I will make you fish for people. Immediately is the word used in both instances. They left their nets and followed him. And then they went from there. They find two more brothers, James and John, sons of Zebedee, which is an important distinction there, and we'll talk about why, who are in their boat mending their nets. Immediately, again, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with hired men and followed him. So almost verbatim, similar instances of that story in Matthew and Mark. And we have Jesus and then these four characters, two sets of brothers. You've got Peter, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, and then you have James and John, who happen to be working with their father on this particular day. So Luke tells this story a little bit differently, and it takes place in the same location, although they refer to it differently. Sea of Galilee being the sea that is in the Galilee region. Galilee is this region kind of north of Judea, where Jerusalem is. And so it's a reference point, Sea of Galilee. In Luke, the lake of Gennesaret, it's again referencing a place. So Gennesaret would have been the more close region just northwest of the Sea of Galilee, so more like a town. So same place, just naming it differently by reference point. And so in Luke, it's while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him. And we'll talk about what Jesus has already done before this moment in Luke, which is different than Matthew and Mark. But there's this crowd just pressing in on him right by the lake, and he needs somewhere to go. And so he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. So we have Jesus on the seashore, trying to get away from this mob of people who are wanting his attention. He gets in Simon's boat, goes out from the shore a little bit so he has some distance and can teach properly. And he uses the boat as a place to teach. When he had finished speaking, he says to Simon, put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch. Simon answered, Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets. When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down on Jesus' knees, saying, Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching people. When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. So the end of that story ends up being pretty similar to Matthew and Mark. You've got Simon and Peter. Andrew's not mentioned here, but you also have their partners James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were in the boat nearby that helped them. And you have Jesus with this final red letter saying, leave what you're doing, come follow me. I'm going to make you a different kind of fisher person, men in this instance. So there's a lot of things going on here, but let me help give us some background as to how Jesus has proceeded to this moment in these different stories, because it's a little bit different from Matthew and Mark until Luke. And so in all three instances, this event is just days after Jesus has begun his Galilean ministry. So Jesus was in the wilderness of Judea, so we just are in the season of Lent. What is happening in Jesus' story in the season of Lent? Where is Jesus in the 40 days of Lent? In the wilderness. So he's being tempted by the devil, which we used last Sunday was the Sunday of temptation. So Jesus has been in the wilderness of temptation, and then he begins after that moment his ministry, and particularly in Galilee, in this region north of Judea. That is important because Jesus has moved away from the central place of power, which is Judea, to a fishing village, to a place where there is little power. And he is beginning his ministry flipping that kind of understanding of power upside down. But in Matthew and Mark, he almost immediately goes to Capernaum and calls these disciples to fish with him right away, whereas in Luke, several things happen first. So Luke, it's chapter 5. We're a few chapters into the story of Luke. Of course, we have the birth narrative in Luke. But in chapter 4 is the wilderness temptation. And then it says that Jesus begins his Galilean ministry. But he has a few healing moments first. These miraculous moments of Jesus begin to happen first. So he is first rejected in Nazareth in chapter 4, verse 16. A prophet is not welcome in their own hometown, right? Jesus of Nazareth. It's the only place in Galilee that he's really not welcome. Everywhere else, Galilee is a pretty welcoming place for Jesus. And so from there, he ends up in the synagogue in Capernaum. So Capernaum is this fishing village right on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. If you flip your page over, you'll see an aerial shot of what Capernaum looks like today. And if you're online, you can Google image search Capernaum, and that's what that looks like. I'm sorry?
Put it on.
And David put it on because he is a master at what he does. So you can see that online. But you'll see in that image, there is what looks like the ruins of a synagogue. You'll see some columns and things there. And there's this spaceship-looking building that's kind of octagonal. That is actually an Orthodox church that's over top of Peter's mother's house. But this is the fishing village of Capernaum. So it's right on the Sea of Galilee. So this is the setting that what Jesus would have been in. And the first things he does there in Luke is remove the demon from the unclean man in the synagogue. So there's this first miraculous healing moment where it says at the end of chapter 4 at 31, a report about him began to reach every place in the region. So Jesus is doing some things first that are stirring up some interest in the region around him. People are saying, oh, this person's got some power, he's significant, there's something going on here. And then Jesus goes to Simon Peter's house, to his mother's house, and has a series of healings at Simon Peter's mother's house, which is also significant to see some of these miraculous healings of Jesus. And then Jesus preaches in the synagogues, and crowds begin to gather and follow this man. It says just before this, he's gone to the deserted place to get away from the crowds, and they find him and start mobbing him, which sets the stage for the story in Luke, where he is then by the sea, and the mobs are just pressing in on him. He's like, I got to get away so that I can actually do something here. And that sets the scene for being in the boat. So in Luke's telling of this story, before he just gives this command for the disciples to follow him, he's already established himself a little bit. People in this area know who Jesus is and what he's capable of. At least there's whisperings of that, there's murmurings of that. And so it might help us think about why he can just say, you all come and follow me, and they just say, sure, we'll go do it. Because clearly you're this important person, we're going to follow you. That helps set the stage a little bit differently than it does in Matthew and Mark. Because in Matthew and Mark, it's the temptation of Jesus, and then it goes into it says he begins his ministry in Galilee very quickly through in Mark. Matthew and Mark make the point to say that Jesus goes to Galilee because he has gotten news that John the Baptist has been arrested and eventually will be beheaded. And so he's recognizing that the powers at be are not in his favor, or those who support him. And so he is moving from that place to Galilee to be not only in a safer place, but to be in a place where power is viewed very differently. And then right away, the first thing he does, before he does any of these healing things, is call these disciples. So to me, that's important because in Matthew and Mark, he is saying to these fishermen, come and follow me, and they barely know who he is yet. But the same thing happens. They leave everything, and they follow him. So, and then you have some healing moments that happen in Mark, the man with the unclean spirit, and the Simon's house story follow immediately after. In Matthew, you have Jesus ministering to the crowd a bit more, the Beatitudes, which happen right there by Capernaum. Like we were just talking about those locations. And then you have the healing and those things. So, two different ways to tell this story in terms of how the disciples saw Jesus and then how they followed him. So, this come and follow me, leave your nets and everything you have and follow me, says a lot about discipleship. I mean, these are the first disciples, and it tells us something about discipleship. So for you, as you hear, just very briefly, this Luke distinction and these Matthew and Mark, what do these say differently about discipleship, Christian discipleship, to you? In your mind, how do those two tellings of the story say something maybe differently about what it means to follow or about discipleship at all? Does it anything come to mind for you, or yeah?
I was surprised. I guess I had forgotten that Peter kind of did a confessional. He said,
Yes.
I'm a sinful man.
Yeah.
And I guess part of discipleship is self-examination.
Right. And it's actually a really interesting parallel to that with Peter and to something that happens with Isaiah in the Old Testament. But yeah, there's this recognition of, and that he would do this right away to Jesus is the first thing he does is say, I'm not worthy. There's this, before I can do anything with you, you need to. And Jesus has just been preaching in Matthew and Mark in particular, this repent and believe the good news of the gospel. And that's the first thing that Peter does without really even knowing, or maybe he does know, because in Luke we've got more of the story of who Jesus is. Somebody else have something they were going to say?
I
Charlie?
think you have to change your priorities because I think it's hard to think about giving up your occupation, the one thing you knew.
Yeah.
And probably many of us have not had to do that,
Yeah.
but we've had to change our priorities.
So, yes, and so I think what I want to say about that particularly. So, to understand those who were fishermen in the Galilee, as they refer to it, the Galilee, these would have been people whose livelihood obviously is dependent on their catch of fish, just as most fishermen are even today. And the Sea of Galilee was ubiquitous at best, and that they were never really sure, as with most fishermen, how that was going to come out. But these were people who, not only did they depend on their livelihood, but they were a part of this system where, fish was an important part of the diet of these people, and so they were integral to the system that was happening, but they were impacted by taxation and by power, and so they didn't have any of their own real autonomy. They weren't free to just do their job. They had to do it kind of under the thumb of the empire, so to speak. And it was grueling, back-breaking work. And so it says in both these stories that they're either mending their nets, which would be literally tying the nets back together, washing their nets, keeping them clean. And this is after they've been fishing all night. Anybody know why they'd be fishing all night?
Fish fight better.
Oh, this was interesting. But why? What is it about fish at night? You might know?
I don't
didn't
know,
this.
but they seem to bite better at night.
So it's at least one scholar's opinion is that at night, because the waters get cooler, fish go to the more shallow parts of the lake where it is warmer, and so it's easier to fish in shallower water at night rather than have to go out into the deep water that Jesus mentions in Luke.
Oh, okay.
So part of the important part of Jesus saying go out into the deep is these fishermen would have known that is the worst place for us to go fish right now It is the daytime. It is the deep water. There ain't no fish there, Jesus. We're not going back out there, but if you say so, we'll make you happy. And of course, the miraculous catch happens. Not the one that happened at Brave Stadium, but the one that happened in, sorry, I'm an Atlanta Braves fan. But this catch of fish. And so the miracle of that moment is that the professional fishermen would have said, there's no chance we will catch hardly any fish in this place. And they have their biggest catch of their lifetime. What makes that all the more significant is that they, in Luke, they had this miraculous catch that they could have lived off of for, the fact that they hadn't caught anything meant they didn't have any money at the time, and they probably didn't have anything to eat. And so, to have this catch and to immediately drop it all and say, all right, we're going to follow Jesus, they didn't have time to sell it, to make anything off of it, at least as we read into the story. And so it's this, what are we willing to give up
Obedience.
to follow Jesus, knowing that Jesus didn't have very much food or money or anything to offer them, and he just provided for them their biggest windfall. And so what would it look like for you to walk away from a massive promotion or a massive whatever it is for you, to say, you know what, I don't need all that, even though I desperately do. I'm going to follow something that's more important. So we begin to see kind of the impact of discipleship in the story, that it's more than just, oh, Jesus is important, we're disciples, we're going to go follow him. But these are people whose family's livelihood depend on them. And so I mentioned that it's significant that James and John are mentioned as having be the sons of Zebedee. So in this setting, a fishing profession would have been something typically passed down from father to son. And so it was like Zebedee and Sons Fishing Company, right? And so his father depended on his sons to help him maintain his livelihood. Their families would have depended on this. And so not only were they leaving behind the prosperity of this new catch or just the livelihood of their family, but they were leaving behind this patriarchal structure where James and John, I mean, their father depended on them to maintain what their family was expected to do. And they left behind their family, their father, their, whatever else they had. So the leaving behind part, I think sometimes you read through this and just think, oh yeah, they just drop it there. They're just fishing. They're just, drop their poles and they go on their way. This was their entire life that they were leaving behind, including their family. Yes, you were going to say something.
I think, in my mind, this is the beginning of Jesus teaching them faith, trust and faith in
Sure.
him.
Sure.
Because I could not in any way do anything close to what they did.
Right.
And it is the beginning of their walk of faith with
Yeah.
Jesus.
And I think that's absolutely right. And this story is about discipleship. It's about faith and kind of trusting in the one who provides all things. They are still understanding who Jesus is. You see these kind of the sequence of events that follow with the disciples, where you have Jesus saying, "Who do you say that I am? Who do they say that?" And trying to figure out who they are. So I imagine in the first few days, and this is just my own speculation, that these disciples they're willing to follow, but there might be some question of, is this really the right thing to do? And as they learn more about who Jesus is, their faith is emboldened in that way.
Ryan,
But yes.
there's a word in Matthew and Mark,
Yep.
immediately.
Yep.
And that really gets my attention.
So
And I agree about the priorities and all of this that's being left behind, but
immediately.
there must be some kind of magnetism, charisma, whatever.
Absolutely.
About the
So
Lord.
Mark uses the word immediately 40 times in the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark is not very long, but he uses that word over and over again. It's the sense of urgency. And one interpretation I read was that it is Mark's sense of urgency to get to the resurrection story, to get to what Jesus is really all about. And so in his telling of the story, he's kind of interjecting this word of this is all done in this immediacy of we need to get to what Jesus is really all about. But also this sense of they are not sitting around and saying, well, gosh, should we do this? Like, what are the pros and cons? Let's make a list. Let's go talk to our families. He's also trying to say that this discipleship thing is something that is done with immediate trust and immediate faith. I think even though Matthew and Mark don't spend a lot of time building up Jesus for the disciples, they almost certainly know something about who Jesus is because of what John the Baptist was doing beforehand, because of the murmurings that have already begun about Jesus. I mean, remember, generations of people have been anticipating a Messiah, right? And so there's this urgency to have the Messiah be real that is also a part of Jewish society in general. They've been anticipating for all this time. And so if somebody starts saying, hey, the Messiah is here, that's word that's going to spread pretty quickly. And so you have some sense that these people probably have, at least in some sense, an understanding that this is somebody important and could be the Messiah. And so maybe that helps us set the stage to understand why they would just so quickly jump in. And Luke makes a point to build all that up, to say Jesus is healed, he has taught, he has done things to make himself known. He gets in front of Peter and they have the miraculous fish. He says, look what I can do in your lack of faith. And so the Luke story helps us make a little more sense of that, because you see Jesus doing Jesus things that would make you want to follow him. But Matthew and Mark, you don't have as much of that. But that sense of immediacy, that immediately they dropped what they were doing and followed him, is a really important word added in there.
There was a sacrificial aspect too, because you said they got their biggest catch,
Yeah.
but they're leaving.
Yeah,
their
and I
possession.
had never thought of that before. So I was reading through this and it occurred to me, oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, maybe they had time to do something with it, but not in what, all we have is what's written here. And it just says, they caught this huge catch, and then it's like, all right, let's go. Wave all these
Somebody else
things.
came in and got them.
Somebody had a good day. Either some birds or some fishermen had a really good day. So,
But actually, no, they didn't.
Zebedee got
So-
them.
Yeah, I was going to say Zebedee was
so
left.
that's right, that's
Zebedee
right.
But-
That's right.
After you printed this picture for us,
Mhm.
I suddenly had a whole new image of what they had to be in
Okay, so let
to
me
do this.
let me
Because
say
I
a word
mean,
about that. Yeah.
this is, can you imagine being in
No.
this thing?
No. So, okay, this boat on the back side of your picture, how many of you have been to the Sea of Galilee region and have some perspective for size and scale? Okay. And how many of you have seen this boat in real life? Anybody? Okay. I had the great opportunity to go back in November with Wilshire and see this. I also went once in seminary, so it was amazing to see it again. This is what they call the Jesus boat, or the Galilee boat. It was discovered very recently, only about 25 years ago, and it took maybe less than that, maybe more like 15 years ago, but I think it was sometime in the 90s. And they found it when the lake was at a low point, and in the mud, they found the beginnings of this boat. And so they began to investigate, and what they ended up discovering was a 1st century fishing boat from the Sea of Galilee that had gotten so embedded into the mud and the bank that it was in some way preserved. And so they had this incredible preservation group remove this thing from the earth, encase it in this foam, and then float it across the river, and then spend like months and months and months cleaning it, providing a protective coating on it, and then setting it up on these steel girders. But it is almost nose to tip the full length of what a 1st century fishing boat on the Sea of Galilee would have looked like. So this gives you some perspective, is when you think about them out on the sea and a storm coming through. You know, in my mind, I'm always imagining like this like pirate ship, you know, where he's back in the back and, you know, there's like all this protected. This could have been what they were in when the storm came through, and so you can imagine how terrified they would have been. But this most certainly would have been what they were in as they're fishing for fish. And so when you get a huge catch and you need another boat to come by, you can see how easily something like this could have been capsized. It's a remarkable discovery. It is the closest thing they have to what would have been there at the time of Jesus, other than some of these buildings and ruins. So you can get online and look up that a little bit more, because it's just a fascinating story.
They also did a testing of the wood to be
Yes.
sure that it was in that era.
They did, and there's actually, I forget how many different types of wood, but they're all wood from that region, from that era. You know, different hardware, like nail type things that they would have, you know, it's just really fascinating. I think there's some videos online you can find. But that just gives you some perspective. And you can see at the top of the Capernaum picture, you get the perspective of the Sea of Galilee there. You can't see the whole thing. It's not huge. You can see the other side from one seashore. But because of the region being what it is, weather can change dramatically. That area can really be influenced. But yes, I just thought that was interesting for you to see kind of what these people would have been in, making their livelihood, and then what they were leaving behind. So any other thoughts or questions that trigger for you?
I was gonna say, it was a big sacrifice to go away and leave their livelihood
Yeah.
and their families, and I'm sure Peter's wife was used to him making spur-of-the-moment decisions. But the thing is, it also could have been a big improvement for them. I
Yeah.
mean, suddenly they went from having to go out in the lake and look for fish and sometimes get lucky and sometimes not. They went to following somebody that they could trust, not that they maybe knew it right then, but that this was an advantageous thing for them.
Yeah.
I mean, this is prestigious.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, we need to recognize that, or remember who it is they were following, right? This wasn't just some stranger who said, hey, come follow me, we're gonna go on a hike. But this was somebody who was promising them something really significant. And so, again, you have to think they had some sense of what they were getting themselves into. Either Jesus said more to them in those moments than was recorded, or they had just been told enough, or there was some divine, recognition that it had to be just, like, something is calling me to this. I can't explain what it is. I have to go follow this man. I don't know what it is, but I have to follow this guy.
It was a deeply mystical
Sure.
experience.
Could have been.
And that's, to me, the only explanation, because I think I'm just like everybody else, and I would not have dropped everything I had
Yeah.
and gone unless I was sure.
Yeah.
And the way that it makes us infer that, it doesn't tell us, but it was deeply mystical and deeply profound.
I think we have to recognize the spiritual part of it, the
Yes.
spirit at work in this place. This is when Jesus has already been baptized and the Spirit has descended, and so the Spirit is at loose in the world, so to speak, at this point. And so we recognize that too. And it's really interesting. So in reading through this, there was another kind of scholar talking about how these were fishermen, again, under the thumb of the system, and they were probably used to people coming and commanding them to do things, but not in a friendly and helpful way. It was the government essentially coming and telling them what to do. And so for some essentially stranger to come and give them this kind of imperative command, that was on the other side of that power to say, no, come and follow me and be a different, use the skills you already have, but to catch a different kind of thing, to catch people and not fish. And so they're willingly following someone's command because they trust it, not following somebody's command because of the power that somebody has. So I thought that was an interesting perspective, that they are probably used to commands all the time. Like, go catch fish and go do this. But it's at the risk of being punished or at the risk of being taxed or whatever, that this is a command to do something very different for a very different reason.
Brian, don't you think it's the same way like you, pastors are called?
So I think
It's the same thing.
it's interesting. We were just talking about this. That this morning, just so happens, I got to spend the 8:30 hour with the high schoolers in the church who are part of what's called the Your Call ministry that Darren and others lead. And it's a kind of vocational discernment process and a way of them discerning maybe a call to ministry as clergy or to ministry as non-clergy people, that ministry can be anything that we do, but just recognizing how we all have a calling on our life that takes shape in different ways. What is it that leads us? What do we follow that takes us to that calling? And so to that point, Jesus isn't asking these people to be someone totally different than who they are. He's using the language of be fishermen. Come do the things that you know. Use the skills you have. There are things about you that make you suited for this work. How do you bring your giftedness to what you're being called to do and to make a difference? I think that's something we can take from that and say, what is it that I have been gifted with that God's not calling me away from, but instead saying take those things and be led towards something that is in partnership with the kingdom work that Jesus and God have been up to all along. So there's this vocational call to this. There's this discipleship, this trusting and faith and following, not blindly, but immediately and willingly. There's a lot of layers here, and I'm going to tell a story in just a minute about.
I would think that the father who was left behind in the boat, even though he had people with him, I would think he would have been upset.
Yeah.
Like, well, let the others go. Now, I need you here. And,
Yeah.
you know, and, you know, I think a lot of us would be saying, you know, think, well, let me think about it, I'll get back to you later
Yeah.
about you. Did you actually see this boat?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
good, yeah. And I was thinking about, of course, it's a different situation, but I was thinking about, of course, Jesus being there, that he had, and showing his miracles, had much easier time. But when Moses was being called,
Mm-hmm.
how he was so, God had a hard time getting Moses.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of, particularly Old Testament characters that are very resistant to their call. But something about this manifestation of God in human form, that Jesus is standing there saying, no, come. I think it's this Messiah come true that maybe leads to a little more of that immediacy. Because you're right, there are people all throughout the Old Testament who don't respond immediately. It takes them a minute. So let me use some of these thoughts about what does it say to us about following a call that's put on our lives. And if we have time, I'll share a little bit about my own personal experience with that. But Mark Adams is a scholar writer for a really great commentary series that we use, and he has some really interesting things to say that I thought this was just a really great way to frame this whole idea of discipleship and discipleship making. He says, in our ministry, so churches, of discipleship making, in quotes, new member evangelism, that kind of thing, we often follow a model of know, like K-N-O-W, grow, go. Teaching the doctrines of the church, trusting in Christian growth through knowing, and then embracing folks into the fellowship and ministry of the church. He says in Jesus' plan, it's reversed. It's go or follow first, grow, and then your knowing comes from those experiences. So what might it look like if our idea of discipleship is, let me learn about it first, let me think about it, let me mature a little bit in my faith, let me grow, and then I'll follow whatever God's willing for me to do. Instead to say, I'm going to follow first, make wise choices, of course, but use those choices with trust and with faith. I'm going to go first, grow through that process, and then that leads to our knowing, understanding ourselves, faith, God a little bit differently. And then he tells this story, which I think was really cool. So when I was ministering, this is his words, when I was ministering with children in a summer camp, I led a study on the church. To begin the lesson, I asked the children to draw a picture of the church. Okay, so draw your own mental picture of a church, see what you might think that looks like. And the doors and the steeple. And if you're like my son, you can do here's the church, and here's the steeple, whatever that looks like for you. My assumption was that the children would draw a picture of the church building, maybe looking very much like ours with a steeple on top. One 8-year-old girl did not go along with the program and stole my lesson. She had 5 pictures drawn on her paper. In the upper left corner, over here for you, she drew a picture of a woman in bed with people surrounding her. She explained that was her grandmother in a hospital bed, and the people around her were the pastor and the members from the church praying for her healing. In the upper right corner, she drew a picture of a can. She said that there are hungry people in the world, and God does not want people to be hungry, so the church shares its food. In the bottom right corner, she drew a picture of a group of children playing. In the bottom left corner, she drew music notes of people of different sizes and of different colors. She said that God loves all people, and the church gathers to sing thank you to God. In the middle of the paper, big enough to invade the space of each picture space, and to unite them all, she drew a big heart. God is love, and we are all called to God and to love our neighbors as ourselves. So they asked the question, what does your picture of church look like? I think that's just a beautiful reminder that sometimes the way we see how we are to be the church might be upside down or inside out. So the know, grow, go versus the go, grow, no. If you're sticking with me. Or this idea that in order to be the church is not to follow anybody, but it's to go somewhere. It's to go to church, to be inside this building, which is important. We learn, we grow together. But the big part of what it means to be disciples, to be disciple-making, to be the church, is where we go, is what we do outside the walls of this place. And so there are some really great stories of people who have been in a job and recognized, I'm good at this job, it's what I'm meant to do, but I'm being called to do something different, and I'm going to leave behind some things. I might leave behind a salary that's better, I might leave behind a place that I know, and go somewhere that I'm not sure what I'm doing because I feel like it's a part of what God is calling me to go and do. And so my own story with this, which many of you have heard, is that when I had a plan for my life, right? What is the saying that when we're busy making plans, that's when life happens, or something like that? So God laughs at the plans that we make for ourselves. So I had this plan for my life, and it involved a music degree in undergrad. But by the time I left, I had this sense that I was supposed to go somewhere else. So many of you will know that I went 8,000 miles away from home to Cape Town, South Africa, where I spent a year of my life being a missionary of sorts. And it was sitting at the breakfast table one morning by myself, this huge, massive table, probably twice the size of that table over there. I was sitting by myself, looking out over the ocean on the coast of South Africa, eating a bowl of cereal, and I distinctly heard a call, a voice of, go and do this that you are doing now with the rest of your life. And that day, I made a decision to go to seminary and be a minister. I didn't know what that would look like. I had to apply to seminaries from 8,000 miles away. But there was this sense of being called to something and having to just trust whatever that was. There's someone who's a story I would love to tell. I don't know if I have permission to tell it. But there are people who have recognized that we are being called to something. And there's this faith that we have to follow to do that thing, because sometimes by following faith, by following Christ, it means we go where we're not sure we want to go. It means we're leaving behind safety and security and the things that we feel like we're promised for a greater promise that leads to something better. So I think when we read these quick stories about, Jesus gathered disciples and they went, we learn a whole lot about what discipleship and what following really maybe ought to look like. And I think if anything, we can be left with that. Let's flip the know, grow, go into that go, grow, know, and just see how that begins to transform our lives. So that's all the time that we have for today. Any last questions or comments before we do some prayer requests? And we'll sign off to the people online. Thank you for being here. Yes?
I think that, when thinking about that, the decision to walk in faith is always difficult because there's so many comforts with the people that we know. And when you make decisions like this, you're walking away from comfortable relationships. Yeah. Everyone is not going to be for you. And it's a lonely road.
Yeah. The saying that I've always loved is that the ministry of Jesus, the ministry of those in faith, is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And sometimes by following Jesus, we have to get uncomfortable. So that's helpful. Yeah.
Will you check and see if you can tell that story?
Yeah, let me check on it. I'll tell you next week. I'll be here next week. It's a great story, and it's somebody that some of you will know. But I want permission before I tell somebody else's story first. Next week, we're talking about something different, some new words of Jesus, and the week after as well, and every week following that. But really nice to be with you.
Okay, this is not a prayer request, but in today's newspaper, there is a lovely article by Mark Wingfield.
Yes.
Oh, good.
And he's talking about how people, they'll take one little verse of the Bible, and they won't consider the context or anything, how you have to look at things, from a different perspective.
Yeah.
Because I bet you be sure and read it.
Good.
Has anybody else read
Thank you,
it?
Kathy. I haven't read it. I need to go
It
listen
is
to it.
really excellent,
Good. And if you haven't read Mark's Ash Wednesday piece that he wrote, it's really pretty meaningful. So make sure you go and find that. It's on the church. The church has a Lent and Easter page. If you go through the church website, there's a page dedicated to this season. There's all kinds of resources there, and I think that article is included there as well. There's also a cool
really good.
playlist of music on that site. Other prayer requests, prayer concerns that you all have?
We're so glad that you joined us in Discovery Class via live stream today, and we hope that you'll join us every Sunday when you're available. If it's possible for you to join us in person, we would love to meet you as well. We meet every Sunday morning, about 9:45, 9:50, in the parlor at Wilshire Baptist Church, 4316 Abrams Road here in Dallas. If you'd like to know more about Wilshire, visit our website at wilshirebc.org, or also check out our YouTube channel at Wilshire BC on YouTube.